Okay, for my next virtual lab review, we're actually looking at another one from those folks in South Dakota. Really like their last stuff. And this is on the basics of how to use a microscope to look at bacteria. And so we'll go through it. I think it's a good lab to kind of get students introduced to microscopes, maybe something I would do prior to actually getting them on scopes themselves. I'm going to turn off the audio for a little bit as I kind of walk through it. We'll let them talk at some point. But here it goes through the anatomy of the scope, and so as we click through, it gives us a chance to click on all of the different main parts of the scope and learn a little bit about each of them. So the coarse focus, the fine focus, the diaphragm, light source, stage, and stage clips. And so it gets us through this. Then it zooms in, gives us a few other things, which again, I don't know how important these are, but plugging in the microscope, if we're actually going to be using a scope in a couple of hours or days, these are good skills to kind of make sure the kids have. So uncovering the scope makes us understand the different objectives that we can work with, and that we should start with a low power. Turns on the light, and all of these kind of basic steps. I'll zoom through it a little bit here. As we get going, we put our slide on. It explains to us that we need to bring the stage up to bring it into focus using the coarse adjustment. It also talks to us about how to open the diaphragm here till it's bright. And again, how to focus it, starting with the coarse adjustment, bringing it up. And it goes into some detail. I'm going to jump ahead when we're actually looking at something after it talks about how to focus. And so now that we have the image in focus under low power, we're encouraged to move it up to medium power after centering our sample. And so we crank up to medium power here. Go through a similar process. This time just using the fine adjustment instead of both. Once again, I'm recentering our sample and then going through this again. And when we move up to the high power, since this is an oil immersion scope, we go through the process of treating the lens with oil. And so we'll get to that. And we add the oil to the sample, and it gives us some expectations here. And at this point, we're able to zoom in using the focus it using the fine focus, and we've got a nice viewing of the bacterium here. At the very end, it talks to us a little bit about how to use these results, so the different types of bacteria that we're seeing based on the stain. I think that's pretty good. And I'll give you a little bit of audio at the very end here while it kind of talks us through so you can get a feel for that too.
Case. The pasteurization equipment may not be working properly, or the yogurt or milk may have been contaminated after pasteurization. For example, by storage in an improperly cleaned and sanitized tank.
So again, it's talking about why you might have non-gram positive or gram negative bacteria.
Now that we're done with our microscope, we need to clean it up. The slide will be reused, so it needs to be cleaned too.
I think this is good for teaching lab procedures, kind of walking us through
wipe the excess oil from the microscope lens.
What we're expected to do in order to clean up the equipment and put it away.
On the microscope. Unplug the microscope. Cover the microscope and put it back on the shelf. Drag the slide under running water to wash it. The autoclave will sterilize. Drag the slide into the autoclave.
And sure, we go through the rest of the cleaning process, which I think is important. It's funny. It's not a fun part of doing a lab, but it's certainly important. So,
thanks to your hard work, we've determined that the yogurt samples are contaminated. We'll perform more tests to identify the contaminating bacteria. Meanwhile, the plant operator will hold the yogurt at the plant. They may have to recall any yogurt that was distributed or sold. Again, to learn more about the purpose and techniques of gram staining, please take a look at the gram staining virtual lab.
I think this is a good introduction to scopes. Whether or not you're going to move on to the gram staining virtual lab, this is a great way to introduce kids to microscopes. And again, in the current distance learning environment, this would be a good place to teach a little bit about how to use the scopes. So when they come back in the next school year, they'll have at least some experience, albeit virtual, with them. So I don't think this would be a good replacement for using scopes. They're so wonderful to actually get actual samples and see what's really going on. But I think, under our current constraints, this is good, or just an introduction to the parts and appropriate lab use. So I would certainly use this.